The tragic story of Boston's deadly molasses disaster, the Great Molasses Flood of 1919. There's a street in Boston where, on the hottest days of summer, people stop walking and look around because something in the air does not belong to the present. Something sweet and thick and ancient rises from beneath the pavement, from the ground itself, as if the earth has been keeping a secret for over 100 years, and every now and then, when the heat gets bad enough, it lets a little of that secret out. What happened on that street on the 15th of January, 1919, is one of the most extraordinary and devastating disasters in American history. A catastrophe so strange, so violent, and so preventable that it almost does not seem real, and yet it left 21 people dead, a neighborhood in ruins, and changed the laws of an entire nation forever. This is the story of the Great Molasses Flood of Boston, and to understand it fully, you have to go back not just to the morning it happened, but to the years before it, to the decisions made behind closed doors by powerful men who were never going to be anywhere near that street when things went wrong. To understand what happened in Boston's North End in January of 1919, you first have to understand the world that America was living in at that precise moment. The country was at a hinge point, the kind that comes only once in a generation. The First World War had just ended 2 months earlier, and the weight of it was still everywhere, in the black armbands people still wore, in the empty chairs at kitchen tables, in the silence left behind by 116,000 Americans who went to Europe and never came back. The Spanish flu had just finished tearing through the country, killing 700,000 people in little more than a year, and cities like Boston had watched whole blocks of families disappear within days of each other. The grief was immense and recent, and people were exhausted in the way that only comes from surviving things you did not think you would survive. And yet life was moving again. The streets were noisy. The factories were running. The harbor was full of ships. And in Boston's North End, the particular rhythm of a densely packed immigrant neighborhood was playing out in every doorway, on every cobblestone street, just as it did every morning. The North End was not like the rest of Boston. In a city that was already crowded, the North End was something else entirely. A single square mile pressed up against the harbor waterfront, home to nearly 40,000 people at a time when most of the rest of the city was spreading outward. You have to picture it clearly. Narrow streets that were laid out before automobiles existed, 5-story brick tenement buildings that blocked the winter sun by mid-afternoon, laundry strung between windows 3 floors up, the smell of garlic and bread coming out of buildings where 3 families shared a floor. It was loud with Italian, loud with the sound of horses and the elevated railway that ran along the waterfront, and it was alive in a way that only very poor, very tightly packed places ever managed to be. The people who lived there were overwhelmingly Italian immigrants who had come in waves beginning in the 1880s, most of them from the south of Italy, from Campania and Sicily and Abruzzo, people who had left behind poverty and arrived in Boston with little money, less English, and no political voice whatsoever. By 1919, they made up nearly 90% of the North End's population. They were not citizens for the most part. They could not vote. They had no say in the decisions that were made about their neighborhood. And they were the kind of community that powerful institutions could act upon without much fear of consequence. That fact would matter enormously in the months and years ahead. The elevated railway cut through the neighborhood like a steel spine, carrying the sound of industry into every corner of the district. Freight terminals operated near the waterfront. Ships came and went from the wharves daily, unloading cargo from the Caribbean and beyond. It was a working neighborhood in the most literal sense. And in that constant motion, certain things became so familiar, they simply became part of the landscape, accepted without question. One of those things was a steel tank. It stood on Commercial Street, right at the edge of the waterfront, and it rose above the surrounding rooftops like a small building turned on its side. It was a 5-story cylindrical structure, painted brown, with a diameter nearly as wide as it was tall, and it cast a shadow over the streets below every afternoon. It had been there since 1915, and the people of the North End had grown accustomed to it the way you grow accustomed to anything large and permanent, not with affection exactly, but with the quiet resignation of people who had not been asked whether they wanted it there in the first place, and who had no means to demand that it leave. Towering over rooftops, sitting between homes and a firehouse and a busy freight terminal, the tank was filled with millions of gallons of industrial molasses. In that January afternoon, something that had been building inside it for years was about to run out of room. To understand how a tank full of molasses becomes a catastrophe capable of killing 21 people, you have to understand the forces that built it, and built it the way they did. In 1915, the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, known as USIA, decided it needed a storage facility in Boston. USIA was in the business of fermenting molasses into industrial ethanol, which at that time was the key ingredient in gunpowder, artillery shells, and explosives of every kind. The First World War had turned industrial alcohol into one of the most valuable commodities in America, and USIA was making an extraordinary amount of money. The company contracted with a subsidiary called Purity Distilling to operate a tank on the commercial street waterfront, where ships from the Caribbean could unload directly into storage, and the molasses could then be pumped into rail cars and sent to the distillery in Cambridge. The man USIA chose to oversee the tank's construction was Arthur Gell, the company's assistant treasurer. Arthur Gell was an accountant. He had no architectural training. He had no engineering experience. He could not read blueprints. He had never overseen a construction project in his life. But USA needed the tank finished quickly, and Gell was the man they trusted to get it done without wasting time on things that might slow the process down. He was working under pressure that was both professional and personal, because the company's executives had made it quietly clear that his success on this project would accelerate his promotion, and that failure would have the opposite effect. Gell contracted with the Hammond Iron Works to build the structure. The tank went up in a rush on a tight deadline, with steel sourced under wartime scarcity conditions. When it was completed at the end of 1915, not a single licensed engineer had reviewed the plans. No architect had certified the structure. No hydraulic pressure test had ever been conducted on the walls. The standard procedure for checking whether a tank of this size could hold liquid without failing was to fill it with water first, an inexpensive and straightforward test that would have immediately revealed any structural weakness. Gell never did it. He filled the tank directly with molasses, and when it leaked from the very first day, he did not stop operations. He noted it. He filed the complaint away. And when the leaking became bad enough that residents began to complain about it publicly, Gell and his superiors found a solution. They painted the tank brown so that the molasses running down its sides would be harder to see. The children of the North End found the leaking seams on warm days and scraped the sweetness off with sticks, carrying it home on their fingers. That image tells you everything about the two worlds that coexisted on Commercial Street in those years. A corporation extracting enormous profit from a structure built directly above a neighborhood of poor immigrant families who were so accustomed to having their concerns dismissed that they turned the danger into something sweet. At least one USIA employee formally warned management that the tank was structurally unsound. The warning was ignored. The tank groaned audibly when full, the sound carrying into nearby buildings. People in the neighborhood learned to recognize the groan the way you learn to recognize a neighbor's voice, uneasily, but without the power to do anything about it. The steel used in the tank's walls had been built at roughly half the thickness required for a structure of its size, even by the already loose standards of that era. The alloy contained insufficient manganese, making it dangerously brittle in cold temperatures, prone to cracking at the exact kind of stress points that form at rivet holes. Modern engineering analysis, conducted nearly a century later, would confirm that the failure was not a matter of bad luck or unforeseeable circumstance. The tank was never capable of safely holding what it was designed to hold. It was only ever a matter of when. And there was one more factor that made the timing of the disaster almost impossibly cruel. The 18th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which would bring prohibition into law and effectively end the legal production of alcohol in America, was ratified on the 16th of January, 1919, the day after the flood. USIA knew prohibition was coming. The company had spent months racing to stockpile as much molasses as possible before the law took effect, filling and refilling the tank beyond every reasonable limit in a desperate push to extract maximum production before the window closed. 3 days before the disaster, a tanker ship from Puerto Rico arrived at Copp's Hill Wharf and pumped 1.5 million gallons of warm molasses directly into the tank, which already held molasses that had been sitting in the January cold for weeks. Warm and cold molasses mixing together ferments more aggressively. It generates carbon dioxide. It builds internal gas pressure. The tank was now holding 2.5 million gallons, 13,000 tons, in walls that had never been built to contain it, under pressure that was growing with every hour that passed. The tank stood on Commercial Street. The neighborhood went about its business, and nobody in a position of power was paying any attention at all. The morning of the 15th of January was not what people had expected from a Boston January. The temperature had climbed to 43 degrees Fahrenheit, uncommonly warm after nearly a week of frozen days when the thermometer had barely risen above zero. People who had been kept inside by the cold came out into the streets, enjoying the reprieve the way Bostonians always did when winter gave them an unexpected afternoon. The waterfront was active. The freight terminal was busy. Workers were loading and unloading crates at the railway dock. The horses pulling delivery wagons seemed almost cheerful in the mild air. At the Engine 31 firehouse, a group of men had settled into their lunchtime card game, comfortable and warm, the familiar sounds of the neighborhood outside the windows. Near the base of the Molasses tank, 3 children were making their way down the street. 10-year-old Pasquale Iantasca and the DiStasio siblings, Maria and her younger brother Antonio, walking home from the Michelangelo School to have lunch with their families. Martin Clougherty, the barman from the Pen and Pencil Club nearby, was still asleep upstairs in the building across the street, having worked a late shift the night before. Patrolman Frank McManus was making his noon check-in from the call box on Commercial Street, a routine that had been identical every day for years. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, a sound began that nobody recognized at first. Some witnesses described it as a rumble, deep and low, the way distant thunder sounds through a closed window. Others said it was more like the ground shaking beneath their feet, the buildings around them suddenly trembling on their foundations. And then, cutting through the rumble, came something else entirely, a sound like machine gun fire, rapid and metallic and impossible. It was the sound of rivets. One by one, the steel rivets that held the tank's walls together were tearing out of the metal at tremendous velocity, flying into the street like bullets. People who heard it said later that they had no idea what it was, that there was no frame of reference in their experience for that particular sound, and that by the time they understood something was catastrophically wrong, there was nothing left to do. The wall of the tank tore open. What came out was not a spill. It was not a leak. It was a wave, a brown wall of molasses 25 feet high and 160 feet across, containing 2.5 million gallons of material that was 40% denser than water, moving at 35 miles per hour. That is faster than most people can sprint at full speed, and it hit Commercial Street with a force that the Boston Globe the next morning compared to buildings cringing as though they were made of pasteboard. The wave snapped telegraph poles and folded them into itself. It picked up freight wagons and flung them sideways. It drove the Engine 31 firehouse clean off its stone foundation, collapsing the second floor directly into the first, and firefighter George Lay, who had been among the men at the card game, was caught in a rising pocket of molasses inside the destroyed building. He fought to keep his head above the surface. He lost. The support columns of the elevated railway buckled under the force of the impact, and a motorman in the cab of an approaching train saw the tracks disappear ahead of him and threw the engine into reverse, the front cars swinging downward toward the street below. A delivery truck was picked up by the wave and thrown into Boston Harbor. Houses on the opposite side of Commercial Street were shoved off their foundations. Bridget Clougherty, 65 years old, who lived in the building across from the tank, was killed when the structure collapsed around her. Pasquale Iantasca and Maria DiStasio were swallowed by the wave in the street. Maria was suffocated by the molasses before anyone could reach her. Pasquale was struck by debris from the collapsing railway structure. Antonio, her younger brother, was picked up by the wave and carried on its crest, tumbling and rolling like a stone, until the molasses ground him to a stop and he lost consciousness. When he came around, he was so completely coated in the substance that he could not open his throat. He heard his mother calling his name from somewhere nearby and could not answer her. He opened his eyes to find 3 of his 4 sisters staring down at him. This is the thing that makes molasses so much more lethal than any other liquid of similar volume. It is not slow in the initial moment of release. Under the pressure of millions of gallons releasing at once, it moves with extraordinary speed and force. But then, as it spreads and the pressure drops, and as the winter temperature begins to do its work, molasses starts to behave differently from water. It thickens. It clings. It encases whatever it has caught: arms, legs, faces, chests, and the harder a person or animal struggles against it, the more tightly it holds. The Boston Globe reported the day after the disaster that there was no escape from the wave, that caught human beings and animals alike could not flee, that running in it was impossible, and that once the molasses covered a head, there was no coughing it off. Most of those who died that afternoon died from suffocation, their airways sealed shut by a substance that the rest of the country associated with gingerbread and baked beans. Within 90 seconds, the wave was largely spent. It left behind half a mile of destruction, molasses waist-deep in the streets, and struggling forms in the brown stillness that the Boston Post the next morning described as impossible to distinguish, whether animal or human, impossible to tell. 21 people were dead or dying. 150 more were injured. The victims ranged in age from 10 to 78. They were workers, laborers, children, a woman asleep in her home. They were people who had no warning, no chance, and no time. The cadets from the USS Nantucket were the first to arrive in any organized number. The naval training ship was docked nearby, and over 100 young men poured from its decks onto Commercial Street within minutes of the tank's collapse. They came at a run and immediately sank to their waists. Boston police, Red Cross nurses, Army soldiers, and civilian volunteers followed within the next quarter hour. Some of the Red Cross nurses did not stop at the edge of the molasses, but went directly into it, wading toward anyone they could hear. The problem that rescuers faced was unlike anything in their experience. This was not a flood you could wade through. It was not a building collapse you could lift debris from. The molasses behaved like something between quicksand and cold tar, moving enough to trap a person completely, thick enough to prevent them from pulling themselves free, and growing thicker by the minute as the January afternoon temperature pulled the warmth out of it. A person caught in it could not raise their arms, could not turn their head, could not call for help without risk of inhaling the substance through their nose and mouth. Rescuers who went in to retrieve the living frequently had to be pulled out by others who then needed to be pulled out themselves. Doctors and surgeons set up a makeshift hospital in a nearby building and worked through the night by lamplight. After 4 days of searching the ruins, the recovery team stopped. Not every victim had been found. Wagon driver Cesare Nicolo's remains were pulled from beneath Commercial Wharf 4 months after the disaster. The last body recovered from the flood. Another casualty came in December of that year. Stephen Clougherty, the brother of the barman Martin, had watched the wave take his home and his neighbors from the street in front of him, and the weight of it never left him. He died in a mental institution before the year was out of tuberculosis that his doctors directly connected to the trauma of that January afternoon. The court that later ruled on the case would not recognize his death as one attributable to the flood. His family received nothing. The cleanup that followed was unlike anything the city of Boston had ever attempted. Molasses had penetrated every surface it touched: wood, brick, canvas, skin. It seeped into basements and storm drains. It coated the wreckage in a layer that made it nearly impossible to grip or move anything. 300 workers converged on the site. It took them weeks to realize that the only thing capable of breaking the molasses down was salt water. Fireboats and water pumps began pulling seawater from the harbor and spraying the streets, the buildings, the elevated railway structure, the tangled remains of the freight yard. The molasses dissolved slowly, reluctantly, and as it did, it turned the harbor brown. Boston Harbor would not lose its molasses tint until the following summer. Workers tracked the substance on their boots into subway cars and telephone booths and shop floors across the city. For weeks, anyone who touched a door handle or a handrail or the back of a seat in Boston could feel a faint stickiness that had no innocent explanation. The total property damage, in today's money, would be valued at roughly $100 million. The North End, already the poorest and most politically invisible neighborhood in the city, was devastated in the way that only places without resources ever truly are, not just in the immediate physical sense, but in the deeper sense of a community that had absorbed a blow with no safety net to catch it. And while the neighborhood was still being cleaned, while bodies were still being searched for in the debris, the company whose tank had just destroyed everything was already preparing its answer. Within hours of the tank's collapse, before the molasses had even stopped spreading through the streets, the legal department of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company had deployed its strategy. The explanation they offered was not negligence. It was not a failed structure. It was not a company that had built a tank with walls half as thick as they needed to be, filled it beyond its capacity, and ignored every warning sign for 4 years. Their explanation was terrorism. Italian anarchists, USIA's lawyers told investigators, had planted a bomb and deliberately destroyed the tank. This was not a random accusation. It was a calculated one, built on the political climate of 1919 with an accuracy that was almost surgical. The country was in the grip of what historians call the First Red Scare. Anarchist bombings were a genuine and recurring feature of American life that year, with 40 explosive incidents recorded in the Boston area alone in the 12 months leading up to the disaster. Luigi Galliani's anarchist network, heavily associated with Italian immigrants, had carried out bombings in major American cities. USI even produced a claim that they had received a specific bomb threat against the commercial street tank. The accusation was designed to be credible enough to create doubt, and it was designed to fall on a community that had no institutional protection and no means of fighting back through the press or through politics. The community that had buried its children was now being publicly accused of causing their deaths. In newspapers across the country, the anarchist theory appeared alongside photographs of the destroyed neighborhood and the damage to the reputation of Boston's Italian community, already viewed with suspicion and hostility by the city's Anglo-Saxon Protestant establishment, was immediate and lasting. But 119 residents of the North End, most of them poor immigrants with limited English and no political connections, chose to fight. They combined their individual claims into a single legal action against the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, the largest class action lawsuit in the history of Massachusetts at that time, and one of the first to be successfully brought against a major American corporation anywhere in the country. What followed was a legal proceeding of extraordinary scale and duration. The case ran for 6 years, heard testimony from 3,000 witnesses, reviewed 1,500 exhibits, and generated 45,000 pages of transcript. At its center were questions that had never been formally tested in an American courtroom before, questions about what corporations owed the communities they operated within, about what level of negligence justified liability, and about how scientific and engineering expertise should be used to establish fact in a court of law. The Molasses flood case established the template for expert witnesses in American courts, and for the first time, engineers, metallurgists, and architects were called to testify in technical detail and have their findings weighed systematically against the company's defense. What the investigation formally revealed in court was damning in a way that left almost no room for interpretation. Arthur Gell, when called to the stand and asked directly whether any architect, engineer, or person with knowledge of steel construction had ever inspected the tank between the day it was completed and the day it collapsed, answered no to every question. He was asked whether he knew of any engineer employed by USIA who had visited the tank before the disaster. He answered that he did not. The tank's steel walls, engineering experts testified, were 50% thinner than the minimum required even by the already permissive standards of 1915. The particular alloy used contained too little manganese, making it prone to catastrophic brittle fracture in cold temperatures. The failure had begun at a fatigue crack near a manhole cover at the base of the tank, a crack that had been growing with every fill cycle, every temperature swing, every gallon of pressure added on top of what the structure was never designed to bear. The anarchist theory found no support anywhere in the physical evidence. No explosive residue. No structural damage consistent with a bomb. Nothing. In April of 1925, court-appointed auditor Hugh Ogden issued his ruling. The tank was structurally deficient. It had been built without safeguards and carelessly located in a busy, crowded neighborhood. USIA was fully and solely liable for what had happened on Commercial Street on the 15th of January, 1919. The company was ordered to pay $628,000 in settlements, $7,000 for each family that had lost someone, the equivalent of roughly $15 million in today's money. The anarchist accusation had already appeared on front pages across the country. The ruling appeared in smaller print, years later, long after most readers had moved on. No prominent people died in the Great Molasses Flood. The historian Stephen Puleo, who wrote the definitive account of the disaster, noted this plainly and without sentiment. The victims were immigrants and city workers who went to work on an ordinary Wednesday and did not come home, and whose names do not appear in most American history books even today. This documentary is, in one sense, a correction of that. Pasquale Iantasca was 10 years old. Maria Di Stasio was 10 years old. George Leah was the firefighter at Engine 31 who could not keep his head above the rising tide in the collapsed firehouse. Bridget Clougherty was 65 and was in her home when it folded around her. Cesare Nicolo was the wagon driver whose family waited 4 months for his body to be found. There were workers from the paving yard, teamsters who drove horse-drawn wagons, laborers from the freight terminal, 17 workers in total, most of them Italian immigrants who had come to the North End looking for the same thing that every wave of immigrants to Boston had been looking for, which was simply a place where a life could be built from something close to nothing. They found instead a 5-story steel tank that a corporation had built without qualified engineers, maintained without care, and filled beyond all reason in a race to outrun a law that took effect the following day. What physically remains is a small public park on Commercial Street, a few blocks from the harbor, where children play baseball on a diamond built directly above the ground where the tank once stood. A modest bronze plaque at the entrance, placed by the Bostonian Society, records the essential facts of January 15th, 1919 in a few quiet sentences. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. On the 100th anniversary, in January of 2019, a ceremony was held at the park. Researchers used ground-penetrating radar to locate the exact footprint of the tank, still present in the earth beneath the outfield. Descendants of victims and survivors stood in a circle tracing the tank's edge and read the 21 names aloud, one by one, in the cold January air.